Good evening. My name is Victor Razzi, and on behalf of the Center for Ethics and Culture, I welcome you to the first installment of the Fall 2010 Catholic Culture Lecture Series. Every fall since 2002, the Center for Ethics and Culture has sponsored 4 lectures focused on prominent figures in the Catholic literary tradition. The series sprang from the Center's desire to expose not only Notre Dame undergraduate students, but also the entire Notre Dame community to the richness of the Catholic literary heritage. In an age where names such as Chesterton, Waugh, and O'Connor have little or no meaning to many undergraduate students, even Catholic ones, we at the Center for Ethics and Culture hope to promote such writers both for the quality of their works and the uniquely Catholic dimensions of their literary perspectives. This year's series, Strangers in a Strange Land, features the writings of 4 immensely fascinating and influential Catholic authors. Ralph McInerny, Walker Percy, Flannery O'Connor, and J.F. Powers all analyze American culture in depth from a profoundly Catholic theological and philosophical perspective. With these lectures, we hope to inspire Notre Dame undergraduates to read and regard the works of these visionary writers as essential to their Catholic formation. Please be sure to mark your calendars next Tuesday, September 14th, when Professor John O'Callaghan will join us here to discuss Walker Percy. On the 21st, Ralph Wood of Baylor University will speak on Flannery O'Connor, and on 28th, Father Marvin O'Connell will conclude the seminar with a talk on J.F. Powers. We hope to see you back here in the coming weeks. Tonight's lecture will analyze the life and works of Ralph McInerny. Professor McInerny was a prolific Catholic writer, a professor of Notre Dame for 55 years, and an expert on the work of figures such as Thomas Aquinas and Soren Kierkegaard. He was not only a scholar and an intellectual giant, he was also a dear friend of the Center whose presence was a joy and a blessing. We are privileged to have Professor David Solomon as our lecturer tonight. Professor Solomon joined the Department of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame in 1968, and in 1981 became the founding director of the Notre Dame Arts and Letters Science Honors Program. He founded the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture in 1998 and serves as its director. His research interests have primarily focused on issues in contemporary moral philosophy, with an additional focus on medical ethics. He has authored many articles that consistently appear in scholarly journals as well as in more popular journals. Professor Solomon has lectured at over 100 colleges and universities in America and Europe, and currently is working on a monograph of the recent revival of virtue ethics. Additionally, he is also in the process of making 2 volumes of collected materials that have come out of the annual Notre Dame Conference of Medical Ethics, a conference which he has directed since 1986. It is an absolute honor to have him with us tonight, so please join me in welcoming Professor David Solomon.
I was a bit nervous about how Ralph might react to the things I'm going to say tonight, but I have to say, just listening to Victor, if Ralph knew that he was on a lecture series with Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, and J.F. Powers, I think he wouldn't much care what I had to say. That would be honor enough. But I'd like to thank Victor and the other student assistants, Kelly Mason, Octavia Ratiu, Liz Everett, and Pete Ferdozo. This is a program we have at the Center for Ethics and Culture that's entirely run by undergraduates, and that's what makes it such a great honor for me to be asked. I've only given one other lecture. I've only been asked once before, and it's a big deal. I'm the boss, but I don't get to make any of these decisions. I'd also like to introduce, it's a special treat for me that the donors who have made this series possible for the last 8 years happen to be visiting with us tonight. Clarence and Frida Beyer. Where are you guys? Ah, right, stand up, stand up. They're old friends of Notre Dame who live in Fort Worth, Texas, and we like to get them up here as frequently as we can. This lecture tonight, and I repeat a little of what Victor has said, is the first in a series taking its title from that wonderful line from Exodus and also from a classic science fiction novel, Stranger in a Strange Land. I was honored, as I said, to be asked to give this first talk by the undergraduate organizers, though I hesitated for some time before agreeing to give it for lots of reasons. I both know too much and too little, I fear, to do justice to the topic of Ralph McInerny. Ralph has been a close acquaintance of mine for over 40 years, and certainly for most of that time, my best friend. His death in January of this year, after an illness of less than a year, were difficult for many of us. But I must say the way Ralph handled it, it seemed in our own selfish way sometimes to be harder for some of us than for him. In 42 years at Notre Dame, I had never experienced this university without Ralph McInerny being a presence in it. I've watched almost half a century unfold here with Ralph's eyes and frequently through his eyes. When I first met him here, the university was all male. It's a quite different place. Poor people could still afford to attend this university. The faculty was overwhelmingly Catholic, as was the football team, and there were virtually no arts and letters faculty members with offices above ground. We were all in the basement of the library, some of you may recall. I also experienced momentous developments within Catholic culture that followed the Second Vatican Council and encompassed the revolutionary papacy of John Paul II, all with Ralph McInerny's running commentary in my ear. And what a commentary that was. Ralph is the first Notre Dame figure to be the subject of a lecture in our Catholic Culture series. A real Notre Dame figure, although a number of the subjects have visited Notre Dame, including all of the figures that make up this year's series. All of them visited here once or twice. The purpose of this series has been to provide a kind of vademecum to Catholic culture, or its near neighbors in the cultural world, for students and others who wish to deepen their appreciation of the richness of Catholic literature and the arts in general. We initiated the series in response to the feeling on the part of many that the thinning out of contemporary Catholic culture and the resources within that culture easily available to contemporary students needed to be rectified, and this little lecture series is our response to that felt need. Some might find it strange, then, to include in this series a lecture on such a well-known figure from around Notre Dame as Ralph McInerny. He has thundered here for over half a century. He has never been reticent about expressing his views on any topic whatsoever. If he had trouble getting his views in print, which he never really did, but if he had trouble, he simply would start another journal or found another press, appoint himself the editor, and accept anything he wrote. He did that regularly. He's taught thousands of students at Notre Dame, and he's written well over 100 books. We'll get to exact figures in a moment, and uncountable numbers of articles, columns, pamphlets, poems, talks of every sort. We're hardly in need of a lecture with the title In Search of McInerny. He has been here for a long time, and he's never been lost. The length of Ralph's career and the range of his accomplishment, however, may give us the justification we need for this lecture. So those of you who've read a dozen of Ralph's books in the last decade, those of you who've read a dozen of Ralph's books in the last decade really know what he was up to 50 years ago, for example? Or perhaps those of you who've read his Notre Dame mysteries, are you familiar with his Monica Quill mysteries, or with his poetry, or with his literary criticism, or with his entrepreneurial development of cram cassettes, an adventure that I won't get into tonight, but is a topic worth exploring, or his correspondence course that he taught called Let's Write a Mystery. Here, though, we come up against a second problem with Ralph. Even if we can overcome the difficulty that we already know too much about him, we encounter the second problem, that there's too much to know about him to cram into a single lecture. Before I go on, I should know who all of you are. How many of you have read at least one of Ralph McInerny's novels? How many of you have read 10? 20? I want to stop. Okay, Barry, do you want 30? Okay, we'll stop. We'll stop at 20. We'll get to both fiction and philosophy. I will deal with this large difficulty that there's too much of McInerny, and where does one begin to encompass this, by surrendering at the beginning. I want to make a series of comments about Ralph and his career, comments about who he was and what he did, a suggestion or two about how we are to understand this remarkable man. I'll say a few things about halfway through the lecture about the extent of his work, and I'll throw a couple of PowerPoint slides up when I do that. I will not even pretend to cover the topic comprehensively or definitively or to tie up loose ends in my presentation. It may be loose ends all the way down, to mix two metaphors. I do hope at the end some of you will be eager to look into the riches spread throughout the large bookcase that he filled with his work over the last half-century. Let me begin with some comments, and I apologize for being a little personal, but it's one way into this topic, about how I'm both an appropriate person to give this talk tonight about Ralph McInerny and why I'm inappropriate in other ways. For the first matter, I was a good friend of Ralph's, as I said, and I will call him Ralph in this talk. Ralph was the most formal of men in many ways, but later in his life, everybody started calling him Ralph. And he would say to me occasionally, you know, it's really amazing. Undergraduates are calling me Ralph. What should I do? And I said, well, does it bother you? And he said, no, it doesn't really bother me, but it seems so strange. Here I am, 75 years old, and they're calling me Ralph. And I said, I'd get used to it. And he said, okay. Even some of you may recall Tom Bounds, a student of ours who graduated last spring, wrote this wonderful piece in the Observer, kind of puff piece about Ralph, and throughout called him Ralph, and it seemed very strange. So I'm going to go with the culture, and even in this fairly formal setting, I will call him Ralph. Ralph was the first person I met when I arrived at Notre Dame 42 years ago, in June of 1968. He and his wife Connie picked up my wife and me at the airport, drove us down Lincoln Way, all the way to downtown South Bend, crossing the river and up Hill Street to South Bend Avenue, right to Notre Dame Avenue, and then north to the Morris Inn, where we had dinner. It was the first time I'd ever been to South Bend, and consequently the first time I'd ever seen Notre Dame. Ralph comments in more than one place in his writing that Notre Dame is one of those special places, a place when one's first sighting is never forgotten. His first glimpse of the campus had been, and he talked about this on many occasions, on his honeymoon, when the train taking Ralph and Connie to his new graduate assignment in Quebec stopped in the rail yards near the old train station in downtown South Bend. As he told the story, he raised the shade on their sleeping car compartment. The sun was just coming up, and he glimpsed the Golden Dome in the distance and said to Connie, "Someday I will teach there." Now, and he did. I certainly remember that drive and that evening very well. Ralph commented at the time that he brought us down Lincoln Way West all that way, just sort of the long way, so we could see South Bend at its worst. He wanted us to know what we were getting into. The South Shore Railway at that time still trundled down the center of Lincoln Way to its terminus on Michigan Street in downtown. It was a sort of ugly, noisy place. We had a long and boozy evening that night, which was extended when we were invited back to the McInerny house on Portage Avenue for even more conversation, and an introduction to the 6 McInerny children who came down for a late night snack and to join in the fun. As was her way, Connie made short work of the children. Ralph and I became close friends almost at once, and we remained close friends from that time onward. It was an unlikely friendship in certain ways. When I was hired in the Notre Dame Philosophy Department in the late 1960s, I was hired precisely to be, in important ways, the anti-McInerny. Ralph had been hired at Notre Dame in 1955 after spending a single year in the Department of Philosophy at Creighton University. As part of an effort, he'd been hired here as part of an effort to build a department that was both firmly rooted in the neo-scholastic revival in philosophy, formally launched by Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Aeterni Patris in 1879. But he was also hired to bring new energy and new ideas to that revival. Ralph was a sort of an unusual Thomist at the time. He had written a master's thesis on the Danish Lutheran philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, and he had deep interest in modernist literature and a lot of broad knowledge about it. And both of these things made him, as I say, unusual among Thomists, at least in this country. He was a disciple of Charles de Koning, the great Canadian Thomist with whom Ralph had studied at Laval University in Quebec. This particular school of Thomists had one of their American bases in some sense, at the University of St. Thomas in the Twin Cities, as well as at the diocesan seminary there, where Ralph had spent some time as a student. De Koning himself was a frequent visiting philosopher at Notre Dame in the 1950s, and other lavaliers, as they were called, such as John and Jean Osterley and Sheila O'Flynn, later Sheila Brennan, as well as visitors such as Henri Dulac, made Notre Dame too a substantial de Koning outpost. The philosophy department at that time was overwhelmingly Catholic. I was only the third non-Catholic to be hired in its history. Ken Sayer was the first, and he's still active in the department, of course. Ken converted to Catholicism some years later, and the other non-Catholic hired before me was Vaughn McKim, who's still active, although retired from the department. And I was not only not a Catholic, I was as innocent of any real understanding of Catholicism as one could be. And as Ralph might say, that's no idle boast on Solomon's part. I had been raised a Southern Baptist in the heart of a culture as committed to a Protestant free church view of the world as one could imagine. My view of all things Catholic, such as it was, grew out of a combination of ignorance and prejudice in about equal measure. In philosophy, I was trained as a fairly off-the-shelf analytic philosopher, immersed in the technical debates within what one critic of recent academic ethics has called the small enclosed garden of 20th century Anglophone academic ethics. It's a garden in which technically trained philosophers, like I was at the time, most of them pretty smart, can discuss small and technical issues about ethics without being bothered by many of the larger questions on the cultural agenda, and virtually never being bothered by questions, for example, like how should one live one's life. That this view of ethics could survive and flourish well into the cultural chaos and confusion of the 1960s now seems almost impossible to believe. But it did. Ralph's view of ethics in philosophy was quite different from anything I had ever encountered. At the time I arrived, 1968, in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, with reform in the air, there was clearly an effort on the part of the philosophy department to shake off the influence of the kind of traditional Thomism that Ralph represented. I'm going to assume that we all have some sense of that dreaded word, Thomism, the kind of school of Catholic philosophy that especially came to dominate Catholic academic life in the 20th century after this great call of Pope Leo XIII for Catholic intellectuals to return to their roots, their intellectual roots in high medieval philosophy. But to return to this, my generation of hires in the department were to represent something new in philosophy. I wasn't altogether aware of this, why I was here. I was a little surprised to be hired here, to tell you the truth, but I had no idea. I thought it was because I was so smart, I suppose. But my ignorance of Catholic philosophy was so complete that I had no clue as to what was going on, and I had no scorecard to tell me what was going on. But the point was driven home to me that something was afoot when I was invited to a little luncheon during my first year here, hosted by a very distinguished philosopher who had formerly taught at Notre Dame, a Dominican priest, but who was identified with the reform ideas in philosophy and who was looking to move Notre Dame beyond its old moribund Thomism, who invited me to this luncheon with very nice wine, and I was impressed as a young and hungry philosopher and very poor. And we sat at what Ralph later called in his Notre Dame novels the old bastards table, which was the round table at the old faculty club over in the corner where the old retired faculty sat and complained. That night we got that chair, or that table, and this philosopher with this fine wine force got on his feet and opened the luncheon with a toast, "Death to all Thomists." Now, I laughed at this, but I didn't get the joke altogether, and I wasn't altogether sure it was a joke. Indeed, to go back to Ralph for a moment, here I am confused. I had never met anyone remotely like Ralph McInerny, and I wasn't even aware that such people existed, and I found myself in this strange world of Catholic intellectuals hanging out with this strange man, McInerny, drinking toast, presumably to the thought that something bad would happen to it. Ralph and I did share 3 interests, however, on which our friendship came to be based. Pretty soon I'll stop talking about me. I'm sorry about this. Like Ralph, I had a deep interest in literature, especially in the novel, both contemporary and classical. On my way to Notre Dame, South Bend, in fact, I had read Ralph's first novel, Jolly Rogerson on the Plain, which softened Ralph up a lot. The fact that I'd read the book got our friendship off to a good start, since Ralph thoroughly approved of those who not only read, but bought his books. Also, my work in analytical ethics had brought me under the influence of a group of Aristotelian moral philosophers, especially Philippa Foot and Elizabeth Anscombe, whose views dovetail in ways I didn't then even begin to understand with Ralph's Thomism. I didn't even know, or if I did, I didn't care, that Anscombe, for example, was Catholic. Thirdly, like Ralph, I had no doubt that philosophical reflection was inevitably, existentially, if not logically, related to one's attitude toward religious belief. My own religious faith was at its lowest burn in 1968, but I had no doubt that the philosophical work I was doing had ultimately to do with matters of religious faith. I was, I'm sure, like Chesterton's young man at the brothel door, looking for God. But with these meager materials shared between us, a little literature, a little Aristotle, and a little shared interest in religion, our friendship was launched, and we remained close friends until Ralph's death last January. Now, my credentials for giving this talk tonight, such as they are, grow out of this friendship, and the access this friendship gives me to understanding and, to a certain extent, assessing Ralph's work. He and I have talked and talked and talked for over 40 years. We've talked about philosophy, literature, his work, my work, our families, the University of Notre Dame, the fate of Notre Dame football, contemporary politics, Vatican II, and on and on. For much of the time, I've been the student and Ralph the teacher, but not always. I think I taught Ralph to join me in worshiping at the altar of Trollope's novels, and also to quit saying silly things that he used to say about philosophers like Wittgenstein. But for the most part, his influence on me was much greater than mine on him. My second semester here, I audited his graduate course on the ethics of St. Thomas Aquinas. I was at that time pretty unfamiliar with the details of Aquinas' ethics, and this was certainly the first time I read through the Prima Secunda of Aquinas' Summa with a master teacher. In those years, Ralph taught much differently from his manner later in his career, when he taught with the kind of informality of presentation in class that many of you may be familiar with. In his later days, he almost became chummy with his students. I suppose, since they were all calling him Ralph at this time, he didn't have any choice but to be chummy with them. In those days, he marched into class, mumbling the Our Father under his breath, sort of not making eye contact, making the sign of the cross, and immediately launching into a dense disquisition on the details of the text of Aquinas, always the text, never secondary material. He filled the board with a detailed outline of the material we were discussing for the day. I still have my notes of these impressive outlines. Talking quickly and humorlessly, not a joke, not a pun, no wit, not inviting questions, although responding to them happily enough if anyone asked. He made short work of what I took to be substantial objections to Aquinas' views, and did so with the confidence of someone in possession of a higher truth about the matters under discussion. I was not so impressed by all of the particular arguments Ralph gave, although some of them seemed to be surprisingly strong. But I was impressed by the comprehensiveness of this view which he shared, this view of the world that grew out of his philosophical perspective, which I had been taught to believe was outdated and unable to deal with the complexities and nuances of the modern moral consciousness. I really didn't know, as I said before, that there were people of Ralph's philosophical talent and quickness of intellect prepared to defend such view with the confidence and verve that he displayed. He did not teach the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas by reading from a dusty manual or by sealing off the discussion from Aquinas' many modern critics. Ralph's Aquinas was Aquinas agonistes, in the arena, taking back the ground that had been lost to modern philosophy by philosophers like him. Ralph's presentation certainly convinced me that this view was not short on complexity, his view that is, nor did it seem to me to lack relevance to the full menu of issues in contemporary ethics, the field in which I was most interested. This class was the beginning of a 4-decade-long conversation between me and Ralph about the ethics of Thomas Aquinas. Now, it would be too much to say that Ralph turned me into a Thomist, although he turned lots of people into Thomists. He did, however, convince me that the views of Thomas Aquinas were still alive and that they were capable of inspiring terrifically interesting reflections on the moral issues of our day, at least as interesting as much of the work that I had been studying from contemporary analytic writers. In the intellectual world in which Ralph had been shaped, at Nazareth Hall, the minor seminary in St. Paul, about which I'll say a couple more things to say later on, and later at the diocesan seminary in St. Paul, at Laval when he studied with de Koning, and in a Fulbright year he spent in Louvain University in Belgium in the early 1960s. In this intellectual world, of course, everyone either was a Thomist or had recently been one. The world of Catholic philosophy and Catholic intellectual life generally, when Ralph was being educated, was still dominated by the neo-scholasticism that had begun its reign, as I said before, among Catholic philosophers in the decades after Aeternium Patris. And Ralph's entire intellectual trajectory was guided by the confident and assertive Thomism of the first half of the 20th century. And this was a time of Thomist philosophy dominated by giants, Jacques Maritain, Gilles Salme, de Koning himself. Here at Notre Dame, Yves Simon, Maritain's great student. Ralph always, by the way, commented that he thought his generation, this has some relevance to some things I'll say in just a moment, that his generation had let their teachers down. They had been taught by giants, and they were all pygmies. And Ralph felt that all of his generation of Thomists had simply not been able to live up to this tradition. But his intellectual trajectory was guided by the confident, assertive Thomism of the first half of the 20th century. When it was taken together with the explosion of creative work by Catholic and near-Catholic writers, artists, social activists, and public intellectuals in the Catholic revival of the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, it was a heady mix. Waugh and Green, Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy, Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, Péguy and Bernanos in France, and not so long ago, Chesterton and Belloc. This was pretty fast company in which to find oneself if one were a young, energetic, and talented Catholic intellectual on the make, which Ralph certainly was. The excitement of this larger cultural formation of the Catholic revival seeped into Ralph's classes and his teaching of even the driest texts from Thomas Aquinas. But Ralph, and now we shift to Ralph the writer. But Ralph, of course, was not just a philosopher. He was one of the few English-speaking philosophers who, at one and the same time, had been a fully established professional, meaning today academic philosopher, and also a significant professional novelist. Now, I mean by a professional novelist, somebody with an agent, with a regular pattern of publication. He was given awards by literary societies. And of what was some importance to Ralph, he made money off of writing. He wasn't an English professor or history professor who on the side wrote a novel one weekend. Ralph worked at it. And Ralph was not embarrassed to be paid for his literary efforts. We once had dinner, he and I, at another university with a young academic novelist who had just won the Faulkner Prize for the best novel of the year by a novelist under 35. Ralph asked him, Ralph was always fascinated by the details of how people wrote. Do you write standing up or sitting down? Do you write on a porch or inside, night or morning? And all he was going, and then he finally said, and who's publishing your novel? And Ralph was shocked to discover that not only had the novel been published, but the author took this as a kind of badge of honor that it had not been published, arguing that his artistic achievement could not be measured by the mere market. Ralph, of course, had offered to publish it himself with one of his friends, and then to be told that publishing was beneath the ambitions of this bright young man. Authors who were slaves to the demands of publication, we were told, could never do artistic work of the highest quality. It took some time for Ralph to actually believe that this young man was not joking, and when he discovered that he wasn't, we left the dinner quickly. That one could write creatively without thinking about writing for an audience was unthinkable to Ralph. And how better to make sure that they're really interested than to make them pay a little for reading what you give them, I think was his view. You find out about how good you are by putting people out there and see if people will buy it, read it, review it, lend it to their friends. Other philosophers, of course, occasionally write novels or poetry, and some novelists, of course, frequently try their hand at something that at least superficially resembles philosophy. But Ralph was, in an important and unique way, fully engaged in both. And I think he really is unique in recent history around universities in this regard. There's been no one like him. Newman and Santayana, of course, had both written novels, but neither, I think, would be regarded as a novelist. John Fowles, the author of The French Lieutenant's Woman, as well as a number of other excellent novels, had also penned a little piece of philosophy, the Aristos, long forgotten happily, which was so embarrassingly bad that he was driven back almost immediately to writing novels. One would certainly not call John Fowles a philosopher. Walker Percy, too, to select an author much admired by Ralph, also wrote both fiction and philosophy. His little book, Message in a Bottle, certainly passes as philosophy in some sense. But it was a one-off thing for Percy, a single book, and he showed little interest later in his career in pursuing the ideas that he expressed in it. Now, I may be wrong about this, but John O'Callaghan is going to be talking in this series about Walker Percy in a couple of weeks, and he can straighten me out on whether Percy was a philosopher. Perhaps the most significant figure in recent philosophy that pursued both philosophy and fiction seriously was another favorite of Ralph's, Iris Murdoch, the great British philosopher. Although I think Ralph liked her philosophy much more than her novels. She was both a professional philosopher, holding an academic position at Oxford, and one of the most influential and widely read British novelists of the second half of the 20th century. Notably, however, when Murdoch started writing fiction seriously in the mid-1950s, she gave up her academic position at Oxford, though she remained in Oxford in a kind of academic environment. But she never published serious philosophy again, until the large posthumous work, Metaphysics as a Guide to Morality, appeared. This is something that had been bubbling under the surface for a long time. Most philosophers thought this late work did her reputation as a philosopher no good, and wished that she had left her reputation to hang on her earlier pre-fiction work, which was and continues to be very influential. Unlike these figures, Ralph functioned almost throughout his career as both a full-time academic philosopher and as a significant literary figure. When I say he was a full-time academic philosopher, I mean that he did the kinds of things academic philosophers do, and he did them with gusto. He directed dissertations more than any other philosopher in the history of Notre Dame. He edited academic journals, most notably the New Scholasticism, the Journal of the American Catholic Philosophical Association, for over 25 years. He prepared scholarly editions of philosophical works. He oversaw the English language edition, which is still in process, of the complete works of Maritain. He founded a press and oversaw the publication and the re-editing of all of Aquinas' commentaries on Aristotle, founded Dumox Press to do that whole procedure. And at his death, he was one volume short of overseeing a complete edition of all the writings of his teacher, Charles de Koning. The last volume will be completed by his son, Dan McInerny, within the year. He also taught classes at Notre Dame at every level, from introductory courses to advanced graduate seminars, until his 80th year. He served as the president of academic societies, both the Metaphysical Society of America and the American Catholic Philosophical Association. He served on department and university committees, and was for a time the director of the graduate program in philosophy, the most thankless job at the university. In addition, of course, to being both the director of the Medial Institute for some time and the Jacques Maritain Center. And certainly most importantly, he published a series of important academic books and a stream of articles in academic journals that defined a distinctive McInerny position on some of the most debated philosophical issues of our day. And he didn't just publish them, he defended these views at academic conferences throughout the world for half a century. He didn't just throw sort of pebbles in the water in philosophy. He was a full-bore philosopher engaged in the contemporary life of philosophy. In a literary vein, Ralph was also fully engaged from his earliest days, when he edited the literary magazine at Nazareth Hall, that minor seminary at which he was educated I mentioned before. His first novel, Jolly Rogerson, appeared in 1967, but for some years before that, he had been writing short stories prolifically for popular magazines, what were called slicks at that time, magazines like Good Housekeeping, Red Book, Esquire, and we all discovered to our horror as we were cleaning up his house this spring that he'd also been sending things off to Playboy in the 1960s. Now, I don't actually know, since Ralph wrote under so many pseudonyms, I don't know whether he ever got anything published in Playboy. In fact, we hardly know what he published in these years. But he needed money, and he was learning the craft of a writer, and he threw these articles around very widely. He had one principle, he once told me, about his writing at this time. He never slept under the roof with one of his manuscripts. If it was turned down in the afternoon, he got it at 4 o'clock, he went down to the post office and mailed it out again to another place to try to publish it the next day. He never wanted it in the house with him. He was the master of the brief story, usually turning on a single incident and almost always involving a matter of conscience, frequently having to do with some romantic complication. They were lovely little stories. They were little prose sonnets that frequently took up two-facing pages. I was looking again at a lot of the old red books. They were almost always on these two-facing pages, and they'd have the text sort of going around, and there'd be a graphic in the middle. He always said that he started writing at this time in order to make his house payment on the house he and Connie had bought at 2158 Portage Avenue for their growing family. Such outside jobs, I should say, and this is a little bit to the side, but it says something about where Ralph McInerny came from. Such outside jobs were common in the philosophy department at that time. Herb Johnson and Joe Bobick, two distinguished Thomists in our department, drove cabs every summer. Father Wright, the chairman of the philosophy department, had cut a deal with a taxi company in town to take on philosophers for summer work. There's a campus legend for many years that there was a PLS graduate who drove a cab and would meet freshmen at the airport and encourage them not to major in PLS or they would end up driving a cab. And Ralph was always upset with this legend, saying, no, Father Rife had the cabs tied up for philosophy. PLS never got into that business. A lot of people were trying to make money in the philosophy department in the summer. We were not yet a national Catholic research university, but we had a lot of taxi drivers in the philosophy department. Let me stop these stories before I have a story about John Fitzgerald running a carousel out west of town. I don't want to go down that road. I want to stop that. I have to remind you, though, that before, one of the reasons Ralph took up writing for the Slicks was he had before had a job selling furniture at Reese's Furniture Store. The articles Ralph wrote at that time have never been collected. It's a nice job for someone to do. They have to find them first. And they've never been collected or republished, though many of them, no doubt, have been recycled, since Ralph never wasted good material. And they're difficult to trace, to find them, since, as I said, he wrote under a dizzyingly various list of pseudonyms. One example, his pseudonym for men's magazine, I don't mean what we mean today by men, Field and Stream and Argosy. These were magazines about men who went out and killed alligators with their bare hands and all that. Ralph wrote some stories. Now, I'm going to say I never saw any of these, but he wrote those under the name Ernan Mackey, which he thought was a good masculine name, good for Field and Stream. While writing for magazines, Ralph was also working on novels, and again, learning his craft. He wrote a number of novels. I don't believe anyone knows for sure how many, before he sold his first one, Jolly Rogerson, to a major commercial press in 1967. It's a lovely novel, if you haven't read it. It was widely and favorably reviewed. In fact, it was because of a very favorable review in Saturday Review, which at that time was a very influential literary magazine, reviewed by the critic Norman Cousins, that led me to read it before I came to Notre Dame. After this breakthrough into the world of commercial publishing, Ralph's first novel, he continued to produce a stream of novels, short stories, and poetry that appeared in a number of different places, high and low, for the rest of his life. Unlike Iris Murdoch, however, he didn't give up his day job in philosophy when he became a novelist. He had 2 day jobs. Now, I want to turn now very briefly, to the dreaded question of how much did Ralph really write. Ralph was always slightly embarrassed when someone, and I did this on a number of occasions, emphasized in introducing him somewhere how much he had written, as opposed to the content of what he had written and its quality. We can all be forgiven, however, for going on a bit about this topic. Ralph's productivity in the roughly half-century of his active literary life, in both philosophy and literature, is staggering. It would be all too easy to allow all of my time tonight to be taken up, what's left, with recounting the tale of his accomplishments on the written page. Just reading the titles of all that he's written would exhaust the rest of the evening. But I'll be brief. I want to throw up some numbers in a PowerPoint slide just to give you an idea of the range of stuff, then I'll return and make some closing comments. I do want to warn you, though, that these numbers that I'm going to put up here, I don't stand behind them 100% because no one really knows, as I say, how much Ralph wrote. There's a hopelessly misleading bibliography of his work on Wikipedia, which you should not believe for a moment. The best bibliography is at the Maritime Center website, but even it is missing some things. So let's just talk for a moment about sort of raw numbers. And then I want to sum some things up and open up the floor for discussion. These are the numbers of novels that Ralph wrote by decade. As I said, he started writing novels in 1967 when Jolly Rogerson appeared. The next year, he published a novel. 2 years later, he published a novel called A Narrow Time. So that gave him the 2 novels in the 1960s. In the decade of the 1970s, he published 11 novels. Again, I have no idea how many he wrote. He didn't write a single mystery novel until 1977, when he wrote the first Father Dowling mystery. So he wrote 11 novels in the decade of the 70s, or he published 11 novels. He published 22 novels in the decade of the 1980s. He published 28 novels in the decade of the 90s, and he published 28 novels again in the first decade of the 21st century. Now, what was he publishing, and more generally, what was he doing with this sort of external part of his career? Try this. Here are books by categories. Now here I'm moving beyond the novels for a moment. Now, the first, what I call philosophy books, and I mean by real books, I don't mean real as opposed to phony books. I mean real books, real philosophy books, I mean by that real monographs that Ralph wrote from beginning to end. All academics fluff up their CVs by counting his books, all kinds of things that they didn't write. You know, you make an anthology. There's a great Polish philosopher in the department once said, in Poland, we write books and get to be full professor. In America, you take other people's books, put them in new bindings, and get to be full professor. Well, I mean by real books, these are books that weren't anthologies, they weren't edited editions, these were real books of Ralph's creative philosophical work. He wrote 22. I'll say something about them in just a moment. His mystery series, which for many people were the thing that most struck them about Ralph's productivity, started, as I said, in 1977. Over a 32-year period, he wrote 29 Father Dowling mysteries. He was on a schedule to write one a year. He just couldn't contain himself a couple of times and went over, so we got it to a little more than one a year. The Sister Mary Teresa novels, which he wrote under the pseudonym Monica Quill, that series started in 1981, and he wrote one of those every 2 years. So he wrote 10 novels in 20 years. The Andrew Bloom novels about a lawyer. He wrote 6 of those from 1987 to 2000, again, pretty much on a 1 every 2 year schedule. The Notre Dame novels, which he began writing with the Knight brothers as his heroes, started in 1997, and he wrote them for 13 years and produced 1 a year in that period. 13 of those. The Egidio Manfredi novels, which had a short life in Ralph's career. There are only 2 of those, and they were both published in the year 2000 2001. If you're looking for Ralph, a book of Ralph when he was at his most outrageous, but I must say, most fun in some ways, he had Egidio Manfredi, who was a local police chief, pursue a 400-pound mass murderer in Sub Rosa. Her name was Rosa, who had kidnapped a 90-year-old Alzheimer's man in an attempt, a misguided attempt to use his intellect for some purpose, and discovered in his pocket a winning lottery ticket. Now, when you start a novel that way, the plot is bound to. It's a wonderful. I recommend Sub Rosa to all of you. He, in 1909, wrote 2 quite long novels in the Rosary Chronicles series, which was to be a 3-part series, and they're very good. I know John O'Callaghan has read at least the first one. Have you read both, John?
No, just the first.
So I've just read the first ones too. They're really very good. These were Ralph's response to the Da Vinci Code. It's the same kind of mad, hopelessly, it's like the Da Vinci Code. I mean, it's murders inside the Vatican, bad theology, bad history, kind of showing up. That Catholics can do it too. That was sort of the idea. As we were cleaning up his house this spring, we were all kind of wondering whether he had a contract for 3. The Rosary Chronicles were 3 volumes, and he had only published 2 before his death. We can't find the 3rd one, but it may yet be on the hard drive of one of his computers. We haven't gotten nearly to the bottom of that. Okay. Philosophical Works Mystery Series. Now, I use with a lot of trepidation here the notion of a serious novel. Graham Greene famously distinguished in his output between what he called entertainments, his kind of exciting detective stories, and his novels, which were his serious efforts at art. Ralph didn't draw that distinction very clearly. In fact, he sort of despised people who had sort of high culture aspirations to draw those distinctions. But these are novels that are, in an important sense, serious novels. I mean, they include many of his most remarkable books. 6 of them were published before he turned to mystery stories at all, from Jolly Rogerson to Romanesque. I can recommend all of them for you to read. Jolly Rogerson, his first novel, turned into the first novel in a quartet. It's Ralph's academic, it's a black academic novel. And it takes a very close look at the darker side of faculty relations and what's going on in universities. It has the flavor, for those of you who are Kingsley Amis fans, of Kingsley Amis's Lucky Jim. Matthew Rogerson is a little bit, has a little of Ralph McInerny in him, but not much. The hero. Ralph wrote 4 Rogerson novels. Rogerson at Bay, which appeared in 1976. This novel called The Search Committee was the 3rd one, which appears in 1990. And he completed last fall his 4th novel, which maybe had been encouraging him to write, Rogerson Emeritus, which will be published soon. A Narrow Time, the 2nd serious novel he wrote, is a scorching novel to read. It's a novel in which Ralph tried to deal with the death of his first child in a sort of tragic way. It's a kind of madcap novel using more kind of modernist techniques than most of Ralph's fictions. It's really, I think it's a brilliant piece, but it's awful to read. I once gave it to my colleague Alistair McIntyre, suggested I thought he would enjoy it, and he brought it back and he said, and I said, did you enjoy it? He said, I did enjoy it, but it was awful. I've never read a book like it in that it made me feel that I was watching a man who had fallen down in a pool of broken glass and was cutting himself, and I couldn't stop laughing. And that is actually the kind of feel of this book. It's a book about suffering of a degree mixed with these comic elements, and Ralph is sort of whip-snapping the reader back and forth between sort of tears and humor, and a remarkable book. Another book that was a kind of breakthrough novel for Ralph was The Priest, which appeared in 1973. It's a large novel. It was a Book of the Month Club selection. It was a novel Ralph made a lot of money off of. It's a very good read. It's an attempt to capture in a long, many-layered novel the spirit of the Catholic Church in the United States in the late 60s and early 70s after the dispute about Humanae Vitae and the kind of revolt of the theologians and the kind of disintegration in certain parts of the Catholic community in the wake of all of that at the end of the 1960s. It tells the story of a young priest who comes back from Rome to take his position, parish priest, in a parish, and encounters all the turmoil of that time. I think it probably will be read for a very long time as a picture of what was happening at that time. My particular favorite of all Ralph's novels is the fourth one called Gate of Heaven, and I won't comment on all these, but it's a novel, again, that returns to the university. It's set in a little university in Ohio called St. Brendan's in a time of decline when the order that runs the university is falling apart. There is an old folks' home across the lake from the college where old retired priests sit out on the lawn with field glasses and look across the lake watching this university fall apart. It's beautifully written, and I will end my talk in just a moment with a passage from it. Prodigious, Romanesque, one of Ralph's sort of thrillers set in Rome, wonderful book. Connolly's Life, the last one, well, I'll say something about two more. Connolly's Life, again, is a remarkable novel. It tells a story of a dissident priest who's in O'Hare Airport waiting to get on a plane. I won't give away any. Waiting to get on a plane. This happens all at the beginning. The plane takes off. The dissident priest misses it because he's in the bar. And the plane crashes, but nobody knows he's not on the plane, and so he gets to read his obituary and discovers what people have been writing about him as a dissident theologian. He decides to camp out in the basement of O'Hare Airport for weeks on end. It's kind of an underground man. So Dostoevsky sneaking up to go to Mass in the chapel and stealing a hot dog occasionally to eat and going back to the basement of O'Hare Airport. It's a remarkable book. I'll stop there. The Red Hat, let me just say, is a big, splashy, comic treatment on Ralph's part, an outrageous treatment, again, of, as he saw it, cultural disintegration of a serious sort. It always just meant something to my wife because this book ends with the Supreme Court meeting to rule on an issue that's going to settle everything in the world. And my wife is Chief Justice in this novel. So it's a special role in our house. The serious novels. Just a word about the significant philosophical works. Now again, the word significant here is a highly charged term. You'll notice the first book Ralph wrote was The Logic of Analogy in 1961. If you look at that list, he returns to the topic of analogy over and over again. And if there's one sort of significant problem in philosophy where his work will have lasting impact, I think it will be the very careful work he did on the problem of analogy. Something I will not talk about. It's one of the most difficult problems to get into in philosophy. Ralph returns to it over and over again. You'll notice that early in his career, while still a young man, He writes a complete history of ancient medieval philosophy, from the beginning of philosophy to Plotinus, and philosophy from Augustine to Occam. He wrote a remarkable book, Thomism in an Age of Renewal, which is another book about the sort of crisis of Catholic philosophy in the 1960s. It grew out of an article he wrote in Commonweal. It was widely discussed in the 1960s, and a publisher asked him to turn that into a book. Ralph sat down for a weekend and did so. Ethica Thomistica, just to mention, the one about halfway down there, was, I believe, the best-selling philosophy book Ralph ever wrote. That one. It's a marvelous introduction to the ethics of Thomas Aquinas. It's short, it's crystal clear, utterly persuasive. Again, lots of people, including Alistair McIntyre, said it's the best short introduction to Aquinas' ethics ever written. Another book of his that had a lot of play is First Glance at Thomas Aquinas, Handbook for Peeping Thomists. Again, a kind of elementary introduction to the thought of Aquinas that has had enormous influence. Just a word or two, and here we have many serious works of scholarship. This is while he's writing about Sister Empty Dempty in the Monarchical Mysteries, the Boethius and Aquinas book, Aquinas on Human Action. Actually, I have a couple of important books I noticed that aren't even, one never gets them all. In the late 1990s, Ralph was invited to give the Gifford Lectures in University of St Andrews in Scotland, the most prestigious philosophy lectures in the world, and you're obligated to publish them. Ralph published them twice, as it were. These books really do sum up much of his philosophical work, and if you have any taste for philosophy, you should buy them and you should read them. He published first in 2001 a book called Characters in Search of Their Author, which is a careful, beautifully written study of the obstacles to kind of natural theology in contemporary philosophy. He thought he had so much more material. A few years later, he wrote Preambula Fide, Thomism and the God of the Philosophers, which is going over in some ways the same material, but this time he's picking fights within the world of Catholic philosophy. I mean, before he was talking about the enemies outside Catholic philosophy who were attacking natural theology. This second book is a book of his exploring. This one, you have to be willing to dig deeply into the history of Catholic theology and philosophy in the 20th century to get into it, but also a marvelous book. But they're all terrific. Okay, some idea of the range of Ralph's view. I want to conclude. Sorry for keeping you so long. Let me just say a couple of words first about Ralph's work in philosophy, his literature, and then conclude. Ralph's work in philosophy, I think, will endure. I think his work on analogy is especially important. He played a very important role in contemporary philosophy in defending traditional Thomism against various of its rivals, and in particular traditional natural law theory. There's been a sort of battle going on about both within the world of Thomist natural law philosophers, and as I said before, between that world and the outside world. Ralph played an important role in both of those debates. His work on ethics in such sprightly volumes as Ethica Thomistica have kept a traditional natural law theory of a traditional sort before the eyes of philosophers in an accessible way, a way that no one else has been able to do. But finally, with regard to philosophy, I think the most important thing Ralph has done, this has a lot to do with his role at Notre Dame, which I haven't been able to talk about. Ralph has kept alive the question of what Catholic philosophy is to be. Now, before the 1960s and before the collapse of the neo-scholastic project, people sort of knew what Catholic philosophy was. It didn't collapse. This grand project of neo-Thomism didn't collapse because there was an alternative. It collapsed because sort of its own weight, in a sense. The philosophy department at Notre Dame still has 45 members, and we still require every student at Notre Dame to take 2 philosophy courses. But nobody in the philosophy department can tell you why either of those things is true. Why does Harvard have 22 members in their philosophy department and we have 45? Why do we require people to take 2 philosophy courses? There used to be a reason, because philosophy had a role in Catholic universities. I don't want the size of our department to be cut, but it would be an interesting thing for us to raise the question, why does philosophy play a special role at a Catholic university? Ralph kept that question on the agenda and made people very uncomfortable about it around this university. About his fiction, general terms, you know, what can one say? His fiction has given many people enormous pleasure. It has been, one way I think about Ralph's work hanging together, I was talking to Father Marvin O'Connell, Ralph's longest standing friend, for this talk, and he and I agree that the great mystery in understanding Ralph's work is it has all this enormous energy in both philosophy and fiction, and how we're to hold all this together. Ralph despised the idea that fiction should be used to sort of project philosophical ideas. He didn't want novels to be, he didn't like George Eliot's novels, and I don't either, because they seem to be just like, you know, ways of trying out philosophy and putting it in fictional form. Ralph wanted to pursue the art of the novel in the traditional sense. So his philosophy and his fiction don't come together because the fiction embodies philosophical ideas. And it's not that in philosophy he's always talking about the novel. I think what is the case somehow is that Ralph's philosophical work was almost always concerned with a kind of crisis in late 20th century philosophy, and a crisis particularly with Catholic philosophy and how Catholics were to think about philosophy. His fiction almost always deals with the aftermath and the fallout of the great cultural revolutions of the 1960s. He thought there was a connection between philosophical problems in Paradise and cultural problems in Paradise. He was pursuing, I think, an understanding of those problems on. Father O'Connell says we should not think of his work here as going along 2 rails, but as a kind of seamless garment. It's hard to see exactly what the garment is, but his fiction, I think, does a wonderful job of looking at the kinds of cultural dislocations in the West, especially, in the last half century, especially since the 60s. Problems about individual responsibility, crises in institutions like the university and the church, crises in the family, personal crises for people who have commitments to vocations of various sorts, not just religious vocations, that for one reason or another they're incapable of carrying out because of the setting in which they're in. The most remarkable thing about Ralph's fiction, I think, is that in the end he couldn't really deal with really bad people. He's like Trollope in this regard. Ralph occasionally tries to paint a real villain, but at the end he says, you know, he was really just like us. I mean, he can't deal with really, so you may know Trollope's great novel, The Way We Live Now, where he spends 800 pages convincing us this man Melmotte is the worst man in the world. And then as he's finally getting his comeuppance, Trollope says, well, you know, there was a lot of good about Melmotte, after all. He was just trying to do the best thing. Ralph, as a good Aristotelian, thought we were all aiming at the good, and we were just missing the mark occasionally. So there's something very congenial in the end, I think, about his fiction, although he holds people's feet to the fire. Sorry to ramble on about that, but let me conclude with let me go back to my text, or I'll never get out of this. One of the most remarkable features of Ralph's life, with this in the background, is a continuity of religious belief, philosophical orientation, and moral commitment throughout his life. For most persons in late modernity, especially those of us who aspire to serious academic work, life is a complicated developmental process in which one at some point is liberated from one's confining past and one achieves one's own identity. There are moments of decision which constitute significant breaks with one's past and initiate new beginnings. We forge our identities, we are told, in the cauldron of cultural differences and with the various possible futures that are open to us in liberal cultures. We find ourselves, as we say. Each of us has an obligation to become his or her own person, and that typically involves a kind of significant break with even the most basic features of our past. We want to be liberated from our past and grow into our future. Authenticity, in a way, is all for us moderns. Although there's no doubt growth and development in Ralph's life, and there certainly is. I mean, after all, you don't learn 6 or 8 languages and spend your life reading the world's greatest literature, the greatest philosophy, without being transformed by it. Even though that's true, it's difficult for me to find these kinds of decisive breaks where fundamental life choices are made in Ralph's life. There's a kind of smoothness of its development that I think has something to do with the ease with which he was able to produce so much creative work. One example to suggest what I mean: in Ralph's last illness, when he was in the old St. Joseph's Hospital, he asked me one day when I was visiting him to bring down a book of spiritual reading that he had next to his chair at his house. I stopped by to pick it up and found it to be a worn and pretty shabby old hardback copy of Pierre de Montfort's Secret of the Rosary. On opening it, I discovered Ralph's name written inside the cover, but written in a way quite different from his present handwriting, in a kind of a funny handwriting. When I took it to him, I assumed that there might have been another Ralph McInerny in his family. When I took it to him, I asked why the handwriting looked so funny. And he said that he had bought this book with money he received as a gift for his 11th birthday. He'd been saving up to buy it, and he had signed it as an 11-year-old child. It seemed quite extraordinary to me that Ralph was reading the same spiritual works in his 82nd year, when he believed himself, and believed himself correctly, approaching his death, as he was reading as an 11-year-old school child in South Minneapolis. He must have forged his identity pretty early, one might say. I visited Ralph's old neighborhood in Minneapolis with him on a number of occasions. We walked the streets he walked as a child, from his house to the neighborhood Catholic school, next to the Catholic church of his childhood. We all feel nostalgia for our childhood neighborhoods, but for most of us the nostalgia involves partly the sense that we've left something behind that we loved very much and that at an earlier time was comfortable for us. We miss the comfort and we feel the pain of nostalgia because we think we can't go back to that. 20th century authors are supposed to write novels with titles like You Can't Go Home Again. With Ralph, there wasn't a sense, as it seems to me, that he had left at all. He no longer lived in South Minneapolis, true, but what he had there at an earlier time, he still had to a large extent. These are difficult matters to understand what this means, but I hope you can see what I'm gesturing toward. Ralph and Marvin O'Connell, his great childhood friend whom I referred to before, have both expressed through the years a powerful fondness for the minor seminary in Nazareth Hall, which I mentioned, where they attended high school. They've both written about it powerfully in their fiction. Father O'Connell in his great novel, McElroy. Ralph in a number of places. They were clearly shaped in manifold ways by their experience there. Ralph once said to me that when he was a 15-year-old boy at Nazareth Hall, he wanted nothing more than to grow up to be one of the priest teachers there, spending all of his time teaching Greek and Latin, reading literature, and smoking strong cigarettes. He didn't become a priest, and he taught philosophy instead of classics. He did, however, smoke a lot of strong cigarettes, and he read a lot of literature. In a way, he never left the world of Nazareth Hall. Now, the fact that Ralph's life had this continuity in worldview and religious commitment from its earliest years until his death made him seem to some, to return to the title of the lecture series, very strange and perhaps a bit dangerous. He might be someone who simply couldn't learn from experience. Think of what we all learn when we grow up. Ralph didn't seem to learn it. He never left home. And there were ways, of course, in which Ralph was very strange. He professed not to really understand how anyone could honestly adopt atheism as a stance toward the world. And I think he sincerely believed this. He couldn't argue very well with atheists because he didn't think they were sincere. In a century in which no one could understand how any rational creature could really believe in God, Ralph couldn't understand how someone could fail to believe in God. Now that's pretty strange. Ralph could also be almost obnoxiously cheerful and confident about his allegiance to the Catholic Church. Once on a panel discussion here about the Catholic character of Notre Dame, after a number of presenters had given tortured and complex arguments for how we might be able to allow a little Catholic faith to actually surface at the university, if we really are careful and work this out, Ralph took the podium and opened by saying, "I will defend the thesis that the Catholic Church is the best thing that ever happened to the human race." Now that's weird to say that kind of thing at Notre Dame. Ralph was also, of course, accused, to come to an end, of all sorts of faults because of the tenacity with which he held to these views and exhibited them in his fiction and his philosophy. It was fashionable for a while for some to call him a Catholic fundamentalist, after a book was written with that title by one of our colleagues here at Notre Dame. As someone who grew up in Texas, a Southern Baptist, who's been around real fundamentalists, I can assure you that whatever else Ralph might have been, he was not a fundamentalist. Fundamentalists seldom are at home in 7 or 8 languages, ancient and modern, and seldom defend their views by writing lengthy books of abstruse questions in philosophy and theology published by renowned university presses. Ralph was also sometimes called, dreaded word, a pre-Vatican II Catholic. Now, it's true that Ralph was born, baptized, confirmed, married, and granted a PhD before Vatican II. But it's a stretch to label him a pre-Vatican II Catholic. Ralph regularly taught extra credit courses here at Notre Dame on the documents of Vatican II, which he regarded as among the treasures of the Church. While he was a critic of certain developments in the Catholic Church after Vatican II, one of his principal objections to those developments was that they violated the documents of the Council itself. He thought he was defending the documents of Vatican II. And his great book on this, Whatever Happened to Vatican II, develops that line. How could a council that produced these documents lead to this culturally? Ralph was not like most of the rest of us, and I think we all have reason to be glad of that. Both his philosophical work and his literary productions share a view of the contemporary world that combines a deep pessimism about the way things are tending at the moment with a sublime optimism about the ultimate outcome. The combination is expressed in a number of places in his fiction, in fact, over and over again in his fiction. But let me close by calling your attention to this one particular passage, and I'll close with this, that closed the novel I mentioned to you before, Gate of Heaven, my particular favorite novel of his. The setting for this, the ending of the novel, is that the remaining members, as I said, of a dying religious order who are warring among themselves gather to bury their founder as the wrecking ball is destroying the building that symbolizes their unity. You see the wrecking ball, and this is little sin about to be destroyed. Cultural collapse. These priests who have been warring among themselves are gathered at the founder's funeral to sort of scatter the earth having been destroyed. Here is McInerny ending the novel. The founder had not been spared the sight of his life work crumbling to dust. Whatever the outcome of the struggle between Faiblesse and Hoyt, the society was doomed. Tumulty felt that the founder had known that. The Society of St. Brendan would not figure prominently in any historical account of the time in which it had briefly flourished. Tumulty let his eyes roam over the grim geometry of the gravestones. They're in the cemetery, the dead members of the order. The dead members of society seemed summoned to take part in these final rites for the founder. Had they given their lives to a failed hope? And what would success have been? We have here no lasting city. Even if the society, the nation, mankind were not endangered, each individual must die. And if death is failure, no one can succeed. Let go, the founder had urged Leo Phelan. Let go. Who can guarantee the results and consequences of our efforts? The living write a story unreadable by them, entering and exiting without knowledge of the ultimate script. It does not matter. Let go. Let go. For a moment, listening in the burial liturgy, looking over the rows of the society's dead, Michael Tumulty had an intimation of what matters and what does not, and he knew a fugitive peace. May his soul, the souls of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace, Philweiss prayed. And answering the bishop and his retinue, Phil Blaise and Hoyt, Phelan and Noonan, Garrity, Oliver, and Enid Fleming, Michael Tumulty, and all the old man's followers, aged, distracted, a dwindling band, let go for a moment of all that divided them. Amen. So, amen. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions. Questions, comments, stories about Ralph McInerny? Yes.
So, what were his writing practices for writing novels? Was he on a porch inside outside? What did he?
You're going to have to say that again.
What were his writing practices for his novel writing? Does he like to know others?
I'm sorry, what were his what?
Writing practices for writing novels?
Well, I said he was fascinated by writing practices. He had so many. One of the most remarkable things I think about Ralph's writing was how he transferred to the digital age with such ease. Up until 1980, Ralph wrote all those novels before on an old upright manual typewriter. He wouldn't switch to an electric typewriter. It's one where, in order to get a capital letter, you had to push the caps letter and it lifted the whole inside up and it would sort of strain your... And he wouldn't, Connie kept trying to get him to use an electric typewriter. But early on, he came to visit us in England in the early 1980s, and he had found a device called the Sony Typecorder, which was almost the first digital device for writing. It was a little Sony thing that cost $4,000, and it would show one line of text. It was the first time I'd ever seen a cursor where you could move. This is amazing. You could type. You spent an whole evening typing lines and then erasing it. And once Ralph, and the text was stored on a cassette tape. You had to have a special printer. And he loved that. He wrote on it for a couple, 3 years. And then he started writing with computers. And that's one point when his productivity just exploded. He wrote and revised. I think what governed a lot of Ralph's writing practices is he wrote such beautiful first drafts. In fact, some of his stuff might have been first drafts. I mean, he could write, and for a long time, especially when he had a typewriter, he wrote, he couldn't type. He only typed with 4 fingers. He typed like this. He couldn't touch type. He typed very fast, and he would type these drafts without punctuation or capitalization. He would type them very fast, single-spaced. It just this looked like Latin prose before they had spaces, and sometimes there weren't spaces. And then he would tape those up around the wall of this place. He was in the basement of his old house in Portage Avenue, where he worked next to the furnace. And he would look up and read those and type again the next version. This was in the typewriter days. Of course, he had typewriters stand up. He had read Hemingway like this. So sometimes he would type standing up, and then he would sit down. He had different ways of measuring his progress at writing. He was absolutely disciplined. You could be at a meeting with him, an important meeting, and when it was time for him to write his pages, he would disappear to his hotel room and write his page. He never missed an opportunity. He wrote, he was very impressed. Trollope, as you may know, my great hero, wrote so many words every 15 minutes and wrote for 2.5 hours every morning with a clock. And Ralph wrote a lot like that. He had to get words down, and then he would revise them. And he worked all the time. His writing trips were some of the most amazing things. He would take 3 weeks off and go to Europe, or sometimes just drive around the United States and drive, so he'd stay in a cheap motel and write for 8 or 10 hours, get in the car and drive home. These were ways that worked with him. But he was interested in what kind of desks people had, whether they worked at the kitchen table or in the basement. He had to get his writing career started with 6 children and without a lot of room. He never really had an office until the 1990s. He did most of the bulk of his early writing, as I say, in this concrete corner of the basement with the furnace going. His children kept their chinchilla, or whatever one of these things with a wheel, guinea pig, or what has the gerbil or something. There was this animal down there on this wheel, and it drove Ralph almost crazy. And he wrote one novel, thank God it's never been published, but if you pay me enough, I'll show you, I have a manuscript of it, about a man driven crazy by a gerbil. Kills his wife, puts her in a trunk, and drives to northern Minnesota in a cabin and writes the story of his life. It didn't take much to set him off with a creative flurry, but those were some of his practices as a writer. Yes, Marion.
Jim, I was just going to mention that I remember he published a lovely article in Notre Dame magazine a year or two ago, or maybe a little more than that, about his becoming a writer of fiction and how he got into it, which he says he just was desperately needing money, and he figured this was something he could do.
Yeah, you know, that's the chapter. If you're interested in, the best place to start reading about Ralph is really his wonderful autobiography. I won't have escaped to tell you. And that article is actually a chapter from his autobiography about his writing. But you know, Ralph was a little disingenuous about that. You can't always believe what creative writers say. I mean, he loved to emphasize, as I did tonight, Ralph's mercenary side. It was true that he had to make money because he had all these children, and salaries, Ralph's salary was $3,700 a year when he took a job at Notre Dame. Some of you may have read the story I wrote in another context about at the time of the death of Ralph's first child. The McInerny's had 2 other children. Connie was pregnant with the 3rd. They were living in Bettville, which was these Quonset huts north of the library, and really had no money and no place. That was a time when Ralph was beginning to write those 2 huge histories of philosophy I alluded to. So he really did need money. But Ralph had wanted a truer picture, and this points to the mystery of this twin drive of his, both to do philosophy at the most, in some ways, abstract sort, and to write, to be a creative writer. From the earliest days, he clearly had this interest and great talent at words and things and creativity and a desire. He tells another story that he saw in the library when he was about 12 years old. He saw a book about American writers, and they had little black and white photographs of each of them with a little paragraph biography of American writers. And he said he saw them and he thought, I want to have my photograph in that book. I want to be one of those guys. Now, I think there's no question he wanted to write great fiction, and he wrote some great fiction, I think. But he did need money, and he thought, I think, literature should be part of the culture. He also was very, and I hope I'm not offending people here, but he was very upset with academics who would get grants to go off and write a novel. He thought it was all right to go off and get a grant and go off and write a book on Thomas Aquinas. But if you wanted to write a novel, you had to put it out there and let it, that was, and to be, especially government grant, the idea that there were federal grants for artists to go write novels. And that people would have to go to a little place in New Hampshire and get a cabin in the woods where they would bring, you know, gingerbread to you every afternoon and keep it quiet so you might be able finally to have the creative muse. Ralph, and in fact he's written about, he has 1 million characters in his novels who are off in those woodsy places trying finally to write a paragraph. And it gets worse and worse, even they bring more. You know, I don't know. Maybe he was corrupted by the 60s too, in the end. You would hardly recognize the way he taught earlier. And
Because I took it later.
yeah, you didn't have a whiteboard filled with.
I had a breezy presentation.
Yeah, no, he still was mumbling the Our Father, though, as he walked in the door. He never changed that. But
the Hail Mary as he left.
What?
The Hail Mary as he left.
Did you ever get any of these old courses I went on? They were, to say the blackboard was filled. And no humor. That was, Ralph, one thing I've spared you, which I usually don't do, is talking about Ralph's wit and his puns. One can go, because once one goes down that low, one can never stop. But his classes, one of the things that struck me when I first knew him and was auditing these courses, was he would be making all these jokes right up to the classroom door and be very amiable and fun. And the minute he went in the classroom, he became stiff and formal. But then when he came out again, he went back to the Ralph McInerny that most of us knew. I don't know whether this is a carryover from a style of teaching in the seminary or at Laval that he, I don't know, but the change was remarkable. Yeah. Questions, comments? David.
David, I wasn't really a personal friend of Ralph's, but I had lots of conversations with him. But my conversations were very disproportionately literary rather than philosophical. That's what I tended to go talk to him about. And the side of him, that aspect of Ralph's personality that loved language was a very deep part of him. I remember talking to him about the American poet Wallace Stevens, who has a certain amount of that in him too. And Ralph wanted to push that side of Stevens as far as you could take it, just an enjoyment almost of nonsense verse. And that was a really striking fact, that deep playfulness about language with Ralph, that I think people who know him primarily as a kind of Catholic polemicist would hardly believe. I mean, another conversation I had with Ralph, I asked him if he could give the Nobel Prize in Literature to anybody who hadn't yet had it. Who would he give it to? And he immediately said, John Updike.
Yeah. Now,
an awful lot of people who thought he was a Catholic fundamentalist or Neanderthal or something never would believe the sort of things that you saw from Ralph when you saw him as a literary man.
Well, you know, I hate to even talk about Ralph's views on these things without his being here in the room, but he did have surprising views about some of these things. He had some outrageous views about literature. I thought that things that, for example, I mentioned this in the eulogy I gave for Ralph. He loved F. Scott Fitzgerald, and they were both from the Twin Cities, and he thought F. Scott Fitzgerald was sort of the great Catholic novelist of our day, and he sort of persisted in thinking of Fitzgerald as a kind of simple Catholic boy from the Midwest who was true to this, but got a little confused maybe. And this went very deep. He never went to Washington, D.C. without visiting Fitzgerald's and Zelda's graves. He would take flowers out there, and he went to Washington a lot. Now, to believe that about Fitzgerald's, I mean, he loved Updike. That first night I was mentioning, the first night I met Ralph, we spent the whole night talking about John Updike, and we agreed, part of the basis of our friendship was we agreed that Of the Farm was his best novel. Now, Updike hadn't written so much then. I think Ralph thought the Rogerson Quartet that he wrote, I think he thought of it in terms of Updike rabbit quartet. I think he aspired to that. I think he thought Updike was doing for the Protestant world what Ralph was trying to do for the Catholic world. He and Updike both loved Kierkegaard, and Updike was one of his heroes. His verbal ability was astounding. His poetry, all of this will be in the archives, and somebody someday will do whatever you do with things that end up in the archives. He wrote reams of poetry, and it's all pretty darn good. Some of you may know a little book of his called Shakespearean Sonnets, which Bruce Fingerhut published at St. Augustine's Press.
Shakespearean variations.
Shakespearean Variations, right. Sorry, right. Another guy had that other. Yeah. Shakespearean Variations. That book started because Ralph was always setting tests for himself to improve his poetry. And for weeks one year, he was writing poems with only words of one syllable, which is hard. And I said to him one day, what are you going to do to get something harder than writing poems with only one syllable per line? And he said, I'm going to do it in French. So he was always looking for a challenge. Now that book, Shakespearean Variations, started because he wanted to take the rhyme scheme, and this was just an exercise of all the Shakespearean, the sonnets, and then compose a new sonnet to fit the rhyme scheme. And so he did that and passed them around to some of us, and they were terrific. And I said, you should publish these. He said, nah, it's trash. And he did publish, but then Bruce Fingerhut found them, and they're published, and they're very... Bruce published some other selection of his poetry, and it was so easy. Poetry was so easy for him. He wrote the best doggerel in the world for all of the birthday parties for all of his friends. He would always compose poems, and they were a cut above what one normally gets at a birthday party. And one birthday party, Ralph had forgotten to write one. We arrived at the house 10 minutes before the birthday guest, and he said, oh, I forgot the point. He went downstairs, emerged 10 minutes later with a sort of 40-line ode on that. He had incredible verbal ability. He, as I say, which led the bad side of that with these awful puns that he couldn't resist jokes at an inappropriate moment. Ralph had bypass surgery some years ago, and he was in the hospital. I was in a meeting, and I got down there about 11 o'clock at night, and I then had a pass at the hospital, and I got in to the recovery room, and he looked awful. He was sort of green, and he had this awful color, and he barely opened his eyes. And I talked my way, and then I thought, what am I going to do? He's sitting there kind of out of it. And so I said the stupidest thing. I said, how you doing? And Ralph said, I feel like that man in the Peter DeVries novel who went to Lourdes and got sick. Ralph had just gone to the doctor that day for a checkup, and the doctor threw him on the... Anybody who knows a joke at that moment, that's quite extraordinary. But, yeah.
We have time for one more question.
One more question. One more comment. Somebody else tell some lies about Ralph. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was waiting.
Is there someone else, or are we done? Okay.
Tell us what he thought of Notre Dame football.
Sorry?
Tell us what he thought of Notre Dame football.
Well, Ralph and I went to Notre Dame football games together for many, many years. He loved them, although we had some people near us who asked to move their tickets because all he talked about was philosophy at the games. We sort of talked and talked. No, he loved Notre Dame football. Ralph was not, though, a patient man when it came to sports. His idea of a good football game was Notre Dame winning 60-0. He didn't like he wanted us to win big, and if we were looking bad in the first half, he wanted to go home or go somewhere else, go talk about philosophy. But he loved Ara Parsegian. He was a very good friend of Ara Parsegian's, and his big line was that we always needed to have somebody like Ara back as football coach. He wrote, as some of you may know, a scathing critique of Notre Dame for firing Tyrone Willingham, which he thought was morally objectionable. He admired the way Father Hesburgh, he was a great admirer of Father Hesburgh, and he admired the way Father Hesburgh had brought Notre Dame football under control in the 1950s by clipping Frank Leahy's wings. And Ralph knew a lot about Notre Dame football at that time because the vet bill, the Quonset huts where he lived, was also the place where the football players all lived. So there was one year when Ralph had 2 or 3 crying babies, and they lived next door to Paul Hornung, for example. So there were parties going on, which Ralph liked well enough. He was no Puritan. He liked parties. So he knew the football team, as it were, from the inside out in those days. But no, he loved Notre Dame, and he loved the football part of it, and he wasn't the kind of academic that thought we should be above football. For many years, I think his favorite sport was hockey. He had season tickets, and he loved the hockey team for many years. He was disappointed in Notre Dame, and he was disappointed in the direction it had taken. He was disappointed in what had happened in the philosophy department. He was disappointed in the way we had done some hiring. There is a wonderful piece of his which he read at one of the conferences for the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, and it's on our website somewhere, called The Road Not Taken, where he talks about the time in the 1960s when he thought Notre Dame academically could have made some decisions and taken a different direction from the one we took. But he was a Notre Dame chauvinist. He had many invitations to take positions elsewhere, to head foundations, to be presidents of colleges, to have prestigious chairs, and he would never, well, probably Connie wouldn't have let him leave South Bend, but even if she would, I don't think he would ever have left. He loved the Midwest. He thought it would have been awful to have to live on either of the coasts, and he loved all that went with the Midwest, which is football in the fall. Right? So he loved Notre Dame football. I've kept you far too long. Thank you for your patience.